think they, I think they have as many as 24 or 26 red wolves now. So let's talk about reintroduction in Virginia, what I hope is the most exciting part of the evening for you and what the possibilities of that look like. There was a report a couple of years ago by a group called the Center for Biological Diversity. They went through and investigated a catalog of possible reintroduction sites all through the former range of red wolves, and Virginia was very prominently mentioned. There's an alternative viewpoint, actually, a couple of them. I mentioned Great Dismal Swamp as a possible reintroduction site, but another one comes to us. Oh, excuse me. This is a very familiar map to Sierra Clubbers and probably a whole bunch of the rest of my friends in the audience tonight. This is a map of those national forests that we talked about. It shows you how extensive a slice of Virginia is available as public lands and as habitats for animals like red wolves. Joey Hinton is one of the preeminent red wolf biologists. He's now at the Wolf Conservation Center in New York doing some more studies about red wolf reintroductions. But here's what he told me about reintroduction in Virginia. Joey Hinton is one of those who reminds us that private lands will be essential to any such effort. You might be asking yourself, I hope you are, what's the problem? Why don't we just get some red wolves from the Fish and Wildlife Service or get them to reintroduce them to our wonderful public lands in Virginia to one or all three of these possible sites? And let's get started on pulling the species back from the brink of extinction. Well, in order to do that, you need cooperation from the state government, as well as the people who live around the national public lands where these animals would be reintroduced. The main state agency that would be involved would be our newly rebranded Department of Wildlife Resources. It used to be called, until a few months ago, the Department of Fish and Game. And it's still true that they get 90% of their funding from hunting licenses. So you can anticipate what their position might be about the possibility of reintroducing red wolves. They are said to be discussing it now. It must be a kind of a desultory discussion based on what I've heard from folks over there that I have talked to. Michael Fees is sympathetic to the possibility in some ways, but if you listen carefully to what he has to say, you'll understand that the opposition to reintroduction is completely political.
Another problem would be, simply human conflicts, and we would expect the public in that area I would believe, would be overwhelmingly opposed to the idea, the locals. And the number one cause of mortality of the red wolves in eastern North Carolina is animals being shot. It's very difficult to distinguish red wolves from coyotes from a distance anyway, particularly for an untrained person. So I think there's a lot of red wolves in North Carolina that are being shot either by accident or in many cases intentionally. And I would expect that would be a significant issue in the mountains of Virginia.
Do you think the Wildlife Resources Agency could have any hope of convincing the local population that this is a great idea and an exciting thing to save the species, assuming all those other problems could be resolved?
Yeah, well, that's a big assumption that all these other problems could be resolved. And bottom line is that I see no reason why Virginia would have a successful release, because I think we have even more challenges than where they've released them in eastern North Carolina.
That sounds pretty daunting.
Yeah, I mean, I love the canids, the large canids and coyotes and wolves, but I just don't think it's a feasible alternative in the mountains of Virginia.
I think those are all credible challenges, by the way. But the important message is you get a strong sense of the level of enthusiasm from our state wildlife agency for any such project.
Another problem.
And so now let's talk about what happened at the Alligator River project, some of which you may have guessed by now. Here's that population fever chart again. And here's a quote from the Southern Environmental Law Center attorney. Actually, several of them have worked on this, about where the problem has been. Basically, the only way the agency has been forced to do its job on behalf of red wolves, to follow the Endangered Species Act and its role as a custodian of endangered species, the only way it's been encouraged to do anything on behalf of red wolves is through litigation. A lot of that litigation has come from the SELC, from the Defenders of Wildlife, and from the Center for Biological Diversity. Other groups have been involved. Let's list the moves that the Fish and Wildlife Service has made, and then I think we'll get a pretty clear idea of why the population went from 135 or so down to a dozen. First of all, they stopped completely reintroducing any captive bred wolves to that population to replace the ones that were being lost. Amazingly, and I think this was a first across the whole United States and in the history of the Endangered Species Act, they began to issue permits to local landowners to kill red wolves without any cause at all. That was slapped down by a federal judge who told them to obey the laws that they were supposed to be upholding. They halted an innovative program to take pups out of one litter or out of captive breeding and put them in another to help with the genetic challenges. They halted this coyote sterilization program. They hid the true population of red wolves from the public as that population was plummeting, because they knew what a public relations disaster it represented. And they declined to investigate or prosecute any of the wolf killings that were mainly responsible for that population decline. The remaining biologist staff at Alligator River is sort of a skeleton group. And now, what about the local population? Heather Clarkson actually lives down there near Alligator River. She's been working on this for, I think, something like 3 years. She's the local representative for Defenders of Wildlife. And her job down there is to try to pave the way for more public acceptance of red wolves. Let's hear what she has to say.
Many of the local landowners in this area just truly and deeply hate Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government. And so in a lot of ways, the red wolves have become this proxy for the federal government, because, and this is a little assumption on my part, but I think some of these people see a red wolf and they're like, oh, well, you know, if I shoot and kill that wolf, that's kind of, it's sticking it to the man. And so that's really the atmosphere we've kind of reached today. You know, from my perspective, the biologists on the ground are incredible human beings. They are wonderful. They are dedicated. They are the salt of the earth, and they want this program to succeed. And they love wildlife, and they love the refuge program. That sentiment is not shared all the way up the chain. So we have this situation where we have very, very dedicated, hardworking biologists on the ground who are trying desperately to save this species and wheel and deal and do anything and everything they have the authority to do. But then in Atlanta, at the regional level, the leadership, by all accounts, really seems to be trying to ignore this species to death. Many of the local
Here's an example of the local agitation against red wolves. This isn't a real billboard. It's part of a website that has been very successful at stirring up the kind of partisan politics that that red wolves have become a part of. Here's one of those fantastic bar charts that you see on PowerPoints, but you can't read because the typography is way too small, and so the message is obscure. I just want you to enjoy the pretty colors and read the top headline. I'll summarize these in a moment. This is a survey that's taken every 2 or 3 years by the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the survey is of federal scientists at land resource management agencies. And what they're asking them about is, are you able to do your job as a scientist in this federal agency? Of the 5 agencies that are surveyed, the Fish and Wildlife Service always comes out at the miserable bottom in terms of measuring political interference. And this is consistent. It's not just since the Trump administration or something like that. It goes back through several administrations. And this is the result. Here's a letter from 30 wolf biologists to the Fish and Wildlife Service. I think the letter is 3 or 4 years ago, admonishing them to stop this decline of the red wolf population. It was a public letter, and it went to Congress also. I want to take a moment out here to say that it is, however, far too easy to demonize the Fish and Wildlife Service bureaucrats that I've been talking about so disparagingly tonight. It may have sounded disparaging, but actually I'm quite sympathetic and even more than that, kind of humble. I honestly don't know how I would act if my career depended on the decisions that were made at a politically compromised agency that's been given a very heavy public responsibility to enforce the Endangered Species Act and to do these sometimes unpopular reintroductions without the appropriate level of political and public support. We can't ask that agency not to be intimidated in this way with a very clear conscience without knowing that we ourselves would fall on our swords for red wolves or some other species that a few people don't like. Instead, I think the challenge is to make it known that the Endangered Species Act and all of the species that depend on it and depend on us is still not a controversial issue, but something that we all need to defend. So in that sense, there really aren't a whole lot of villains to choose from here. As usual in a democracy, the responsibility, some of it comes back to rest with us. I want you to hear next from Maggie Howell, who's got one of the largest red wolf captive breeding programs at the Wolf Conservation Center in New York. And the reason I put her in tonight's program is to let you know the consequences of keeping wolves ready for reintroduction and raising generations of them in captivity and not being able to put them back out in the wild. She's been doing that for quite a long time now, and so have most of the other people involved in this program.
If I'm talking to people in Virginia or Western North Carolina or Arkansas or someplace about the possibility of reintroducing red wolves there, would you welcome that possibility for the wolves that...
I don't know if we would.
You would love to see your wolves back in the wild in some new reintroduction program, but only if the Fish and Wildlife Service takes better care of them?
Yeah. It's really discouraging, and again, not only discouraging for our staff and our volunteers and everyone, but we want all of our constituents to care about these animals and to support recovery in the wild. We don't want to have captive wolves forever. The whole purpose of having these animals is we really want them to be functioning as viable wolves on the wild landscape. We want them to be doing what they do, hunting and having pups and having their ecological impact on their native ecosystem. That's where they belong.
If I...
Oh, okay. I mentioned that there's been a lot of litigation around red wolves to push and push and push on this reluctant agency to do what it has promised to do and what the law demands of it. The latest litigation resulted in an order from a federal judge, not a big liberal judge either, down in North Carolina, admonishing the agency and telling them they have to release more red wolves into the wild. That's the source of the release of 4 red wolves this past April. It's a good thing to do, but it's a short-term thing. It's not even a fix in terms of getting this population reestablished. And you get the strong feeling, that is, the attorneys who work on these cases have told me about their strong feeling, that this is just window dressing for this foot-dragging agency to avoid further judicial scrutiny and to not look like they're defying a court order. They're supposedly working on a new plan for reintroductions. We'll see what happens. It's a very quiet and very protracted kind of planning. This is a letter which is signed last October by our own Don McEachin, representative from Richmond, and Don Beyer from Northern Virginia. These and 30 other members of the House of Representatives sent quite a strong letter admonishing the House of Representatives to do more for the red wolves and to be a lot more ambitious. One of the signers was Deb Haaland, who has since become the Secretary of the Interior under the Biden administration. And with that appointment, we can hope that red wolves get additional attention and that the agency gets some prodding that will carry it through more than just a couple of weeks of attention to the problem. The letter points out what the authors say is needed for red wolves now. Additional lands. Well, that sounds like us. And this sounds like something to do with an education program, a public education program, to remind people that red wolves once lived here in great numbers, that this was their home, to remind them that these are not animals that represent a threat to people or to livestock. In 30 years, I think 6 episodes of preying on chickens were documented. These animals belong on the landscape, and they would prove to have very few problems. Their main problem is, as we've said, us. So there are lots of reasons why not to do anything on behalf of red wolves. It's too expensive, so we can't do it. Environmental groups have severely limited funds to spend on this kind of thing. And with the way our political situation is, we're all over familiar with that. This is just impossible to take on. Red wolves are too radioactive. We can't do that kind of thing. We've got too much else to pay attention to. Those are good, wised up objections, but they remind me of a time in the early 1960s when the very powerful Bureau of Reclamation had proposed, and it was a very popular proposal in Congress, to build 2 dams along the Colorado River in the inner gorge of Grand Canyon. And everybody said, well, we can't fight that. We've got too many other things happening here. Our plates are full. And at the time, David Brower, sometimes known as the Arch Druid, was the head of the Sierra Club. He listened to all these naysayers. He observed the situation that was unfolding in the Grand Canyon, and here's what he had to say. To my mind, the same situation applies to red wolves. If we can't keep this magnificent animal from extinction, really, haven't we thrown in the towel on a great deal of the environmental and conservation agenda? If this is something that interests you, an initial step is to contact your state delegates and state senators. You can find out who they are if you don't know offhand by going to vpap.org. All you have to do is type in your address, and out come your state senators and your state delegate. Under discussion now are 3 initiatives, a sort of a soft approach recognizing the difficulties of the situation to reintroduction of red wolves in Virginia. It's going to have to happen from the state level because of the nature of the Fish and Wildlife Agency, which has, by the way, said that it is eager to cooperate with states that want to do reintroductions. One move, purely honorific, but really important for public discussion, would be to name red wolves as a state mammal. We don't have a state mammal. We have a state bat. It's the long-eared bat, and it's really a cool animal. It's been there for 15 years. It would be a great idea to name red wolves as a state mammal, and it would cost nothing to support that idea. And we'll see whether we can drum up some interest among state legislators to do that. 4 or 5 of them are already interested in the House of Delegates. Red wolves live here. They are living here in captivity, but they are still with us. They are not extinct in the state of Virginia. There are 11 of them. They used to live here, and they really ought to become part of the state endangered species list, which would open up lots of other possibilities for discussion about reintroduction. And it would be a reminder of our responsibilities to that species. And finally, a public education program. There's a template for this. In Colorado, there was a successful public education program which led to a successful referendum on reintroducing gray wolves there. And it was a referendum that prevailed. So that program is underway there, but I don't think it could have happened without a very well worked out way of letting school kids and church groups, and most of all, the people who live around our public lands, know what a wonderful thing it would be to reintroduce these animals and that they don't represent any kind of threat. Here's my email address if you're interested in learning any more about this after letting me bend your ears so thoroughly all night long. I've written about this for the Washington Post and for the Progressive magazine. If you write to me, I would be more than pleased to send you copies of those articles. And thank you so much. What a lot of fun for me to tell you all about this stuff.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I see there are some questions in the chat. Okay, Linda, you asked, what is the impact of human handlers of red wolf pups, and will they be overly accepting of humans once in the wild, which they may put them in danger?
Yes, that's exactly what happens if they are not handled very, very carefully in captivity. And during the course of the 30 or 40 years this program has been underway, that is a lesson that has been very well learned. Let me add that it would please me to think that we could just keep all of them in captivity indefinitely and keep breeding them, and that would be great on into the indefinite future until nirvana arrives and there's a sympathetic administration at the state and federal level and they could be safely reintroduced. But that can't happen either. The clock is ticking even for the animals in captivity, no matter how carefully they are tended and how carefully they're prepared for release. The clock we think of as evolution, just like captive bred trout or any other animals that are captive bred. Evolution is at work selecting that population for living in captivity and not for living in the wild. So what geneticists say is if this goes on long enough, they will no longer be capable of sustaining themselves in the wild.
Joe, did you want to take over fielding questions?
Sure. I see from Jackson Sandler Boosie. The question is, if we started today, how long do you think it would take to bring the red wolf population to pre-2014 levels?
I assume that the question is about bringing them back to those levels at Alligator River. And the estimate I've heard is 8 to 10 years. That's how much opportunity has been wasted.
Thank you. I'll note that Richard Gruber has stated he will cover this topic in his graduate seminar course. That is excellent.
Hi, Richard, and thank you.
I do not see any other questions in Zoom at this time.
I guess Richard did ask if we could get a copy of this presentation. Well, it's going to be mostly there because we had a little more complications in our programming because Glenn had to show the slideshow. And I'm not sure if I recorded the right way and I started late, so we'll see if it goes. I recorded it to the cloud, so hopefully Glenn can retrieve it because he's the owner of this program. So I'm sorry it won't all be there because we didn't prepare for this possibility. Okay.
I see.
Actually,
wait,
can I just ask a question? Because unfortunately, I seem to be direct messaging. But is there any attempt as part of the educational attempts to promote their benefit to the local communities? Because that was a really big problem out in Yellowstone. The local communities didn't consider that there was an environmental benefit that benefited them. They just never saw that.
Yes, that's a prominent part of the McEachin and Beyer letter, which is that people need to know the good that a healthy ecosystem does for them. That would definitely be part of what's presented. And you're right, the more we learn how to do reintroductions, the better that pitch can be.
We have 3 more questions now in the chat from Maddie Hitching. Could you share more about the successful Colorado program to reintroduce gray wolves and how that would work for the reintroduction of red wolves?
The sequence of events in Colorado, which has a very different political makeup, but just as much political opposition to a new predator on the landscape, especially since timber wolves are a much larger and more powerful animal, and they will prey on livestock in a way that red wolves won't. But the sequence of events was just shy of 10 years, as I understand it, of public discussion and workshops around the state and attempts to alleviate the very predictable disinformation campaigns that sprang up. And so it eventually prevailed. It took place, as I've mentioned, in schools and on university campuses and in focus groups around the state. People discussed their fears and their misapprehensions. And then when the time came for the referendum to be introduced, it was successful. I should say, realistically, it wasn't a resounding success. It was a majority vote, but it was a much more slender majority than the supporters had hoped. Nonetheless, a win is a win, and they are under a deadline now to reintroduce those wolves. It was a referendum with teeth in it. There was no room for stalling, fortunately.
Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Next question. Has the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Center been used?
Let me think about that. The Smithsonian does have a canid expert who is said to be very good, but I think the problem there, I'm not sure what you mean by being used, but I think the problem for them in being involved in reintroductions that haven't been resolved politically yet is that they would be seen to be stepping on the toes of the Fish and Wildlife Service. And, you know, federal agencies are careful not to do that under ordinary circumstances. So, yeah, I've spoken with a couple of those people, and I know, and you can imagine how enthusiastic they would be, but it's not as if they could raise flags and march out into Northern Virginia counties campaigning for this.
Right. Next question is, what are some strategies to help local citizens differentiate between red wolves and coyotes?
What's being tried, what has been advocated and tried to a limited extent in North Carolina is a very simple stratagem of putting very bright collars on the wolves, maybe even glow-in-the-dark vests, which don't impede the rest of what they have to do in life, so that nobody will have the excuse that they thought it was a coyote. There's really a lot of marvelous technology out there. It's transitional in the sense that you don't want the rest of their history down through the ages to have to include illuminated vests. But it's a way of getting past the current very dangerous impasse for this species.
Right, thank you. I'm going to combine two questions about different organizations and whether it's in their purview to help with this effort. One is the U.S. Forest Service, and the other is the Nature Conservancy.
I'm going to mention an organization whom we know to be interested, and we know that it's well within their purview, and it's called the Sierra Club. It would be great if the club could endorse these legislative initiatives at the state level. The U.S. Forest Service has no interest in picking fights over red wolves. This is the kind of thing that federal operatives walk backwards from just as fast as they can. The Nature Conservancy is a wonderful outfit with a different agenda about acquiring and managing wild places. I don't know that they have an outlook one way or the other on reintroducing species, but they're very good at grooming contributions from folks in order to acquire those landscapes. And I can't gainsay that, but I have the feeling that they wouldn't be real interested, like the Sierra Club might be.
Good point. Next question is, have the threats to neighbors in North Carolina been real or anticipated? What are the risks?
The threats to the neighbors have been anticipated and widely fictionalized. This actually started happening at Great Smoky Mountains National Park when the late, not great Chet Helms, a name some of you may recognize from the US Congress, was telling people that red wolves were going to eat their poodles and attack their children. He made up spurious examples of attacks like that, which were thoroughly debunked. But of course, once that kind of stuff is out, even before the age of social media, it has a very powerful influence, as usual, in conjuring up a lot of fear and hate. There were no attacks on any humans from red wolves. There never have been. There have been just a tiny number of, after 30 years of red wolves preying on chickens. And in one case, I think somebody's pet. Those are real situations, but on the other hand, there were 10,000 canid attacks on Virginians last year, according to the State Department of Health. Those canids are called dogs popularly, and we get along with them, and we have more and more of them around, despite the fact that they bite people and maim people on a regular basis. It's because we've learned to accept them as a legitimate part of the landscape. We have feral dogs that are far more dangerous than a red wolf would ever be. So I guess that's kind of a long-winded answer, pardon me.
Appreciate it. That's all I see in the chat at this time. Wait, no, here comes one from Glenn Bessa. What about wolf tourism? For example, folks going to Minnesota who go there to hear and see wolves.
I think that would be terrific. I think you can hear those wolves howl at night like we did tonight when they're out there. There is a kind of magnetism, certainly at places like Yellowstone, but lots of other places too, where wolves are around. Even coyotes can draw that kind of interest. These, I guess I've maybe overused the word magnificent tonight, but they really are fantastic animals. And I think if they were around in sufficient numbers to see, or more likely hear from, or just to know that they're out there in the wild, and I know I'm preaching to the choir here, just to know that wilderness is out there and the legitimate inhabitants of that wilderness are out there are things that people would really appreciate. And yes, they would bring their wallets and purses with them.
All right, thank you. I'll throw in a question here, Steve. This is a bit of a tangent, but the professional football team in Washington, D.C., jettisoned their former name 2 seasons ago, has not chosen a new name. My understanding is Red Wolves is one of the possibilities. Do you see any positive impact on public awareness if they were to become the Washington Red Wolves?
A ton. They've been encouraged by conservation groups to adopt red wolves. There have actually been informal polls among sports writers and fans of the club about their favorite name, and red wolves poll very, very well. I don't know how you get into the inner sanctums of folks like that, but I hope they are actively considering it. And yes, it would be an enormous boost. There's a team called the Red Wolves at Arkansas State University, and that is one of the sites that has been proposed for reintroduction too, not the university, but the state. And I can't help but think that it would do something to defuse some of the opposition that one hears to projects like this.
Yeah. Be pretty cool if they had a section, an exhibit at their stadium or something also. Just
lots of wonderful PR opportunities.
Right. All right, that's all that I see in the chat.
Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much again for letting us spend time together this evening. And I'd love to hear from you, but more than that, I'd love for your legislators to hear from you and your favorite conservation group.
Tremendous thanks to you, Steve, for being here.
Thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
I'll mention that we offer all our speakers a small stipend as a token of our appreciation, and Steve was kind enough to redirect that $50 back to the Sierra Club, which is wonderful. And
it's also a bribe. It's a bribe. Everybody knows this.
And if I remember correctly, Steve also offered his home several years ago for a fundraiser for the Sierra Club Virginia PAC. So, Steve, thank you for all you've done and for this evening.
Thanks to all of you.
Now we're going to turn to a few quick announcements, which I see on the screen. I believe you might also. Our next program on October 12th will feature as speaker Richmond City Councilwoman Catherine Jordan, who introduced the climate emergency resolution, which just passed City Council last night when all 9 City Council people in Richmond made good on their pledges by voting for this climate emergency resolution. There are numerous excellent points within this resolution, and our job now, our enjoyable job, will be to turn some of these into ordinances. You can see there some of the items that are included in there: electrifying the city's vehicle fleet, expanding the Urban Forestry Commission, green infrastructure for stormwater runoff, phasing out the Richmond Gas Works so that Richmond stops promoting the use of fracked gas. The thing now is also that Mayor Stoney and his administration has to have a role in this. They must allocate significant money to it. From the American Rescue Plan, we're asking for at least 30%. So we're asking you to contact Mayor Stoney and encourage that level of commitment, of financial commitment. I will mention next that this Thursday there is a Falls of James Group Advocacy Committee meeting. Chairwoman Lee Williams will be hosting that, and that is at 7 p.m. The link is included. We'd love to see anyone there. We talk about our campaigns and our efforts, such as the climate emergency resolution, at this monthly meeting. On this coming Saturday, September 18th, is the next work day at Belmead Park. This is a location that the Sierra Club that the Falls of James Group has volunteered at for several years now. And Bob Argabright is the local community person who has spearheaded this effort to transform the property of Belmead Community Center, Oak Grove School, into a wonderful, wonderful park. And you see some dates there. Next one coming up is this Saturday. Our Falls of James Group Skip the Plastics Committee meets on September 24th. Again, we welcome anybody to attend and join in the effort to curtail the use of plastics. I don't think I need to emphasize why that's a great idea, a great concept. And finally, our Membership Engagement Committee meets on September 29th. I said finally, but that's finally for our committees. Let me also mention that tomorrow, that's right, tomorrow at 11:30 a.m., there is an event, one in a series of ongoing rallies at Senator Mark Warner's office, downtown Richmond, 919 East Main Street. And this one is part of the Blue-Green Alliance, the alliance of conservationists and labor. And tomorrow's rally will include a letter drop, and it is in coordination with Nabisco's striking workers. That's at Senator Warner's office, outside Senator Warner's office, 919 East Main Street, 11:30 tomorrow morning. And for your pleasure in exploring the outdoors, we have outings coming up this fall. You see a lovely photograph there. One is the Lower Appomattox River Trail in Petersburg. And stay tuned for other outings coming up. That will conclude our program tonight. And of course, thank you for attending. Thanks to Glenn Bessa for setting up and using his Zoom account, and to Siobhan Peacock for hosting tonight. I will also announce our meetings will continue to be virtual for the rest of this fall. That is not a decision of the Sierra Club, but it is a decision of the Science Museum, which served as a wonderful host to us for years now. They are not entertaining any in-person meetings until at least January. So join us back at your computer, please, on October 12th for City Councilwoman Catherine Jordan. And again, thank you very much for joining tonight. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thank you again, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Oh, that was good.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. I heard that, Roger. How are
All
you?
right. Thank you. I heard you too.
Okay.
You know, it's past 8 o'clock. You girls need to go to sleep. I was listening to the Red Wolves.
Oops.